Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah with Got Safety, here with another lesson, this time on sexual harassment in the workplace. Before we begin, remember to sign off on your mobile device or on gotsafety.com to receive credit for this training. If you feel the need to pause this video at any time to have a moment of discussion, we encourage you to do so. The main purpose of this lesson will be to define what sexual harassment is and what steps to follow in the event you are sexually harassed. Sexual harassment is defined as uninvited, unwelcome, non-consensual, and inappropriate physical or verbal behavior or conduct of a sexual or gender-based nature that is directed at an unwilling participant. The key word there is unwilling. It is unwarranted and unwanted. Sexual harassment is often severe and pervasive and can have a severe negative impact in the work environment. The victim can be male or female or someone who is fluid in their gender, and the harasser is not always of the opposite sex. Sexual harassment is illegal, and there are laws that protect victims in situations where the conduct is ongoing and severe. As we continue, be mindful of ways you can better recognize harassment in your work environment and therefore take action when it becomes necessary. Some types of harassment behaviors are blatant, while others may be less obvious. Examples of unwelcome behavior that may be viewed as sexual harassment include making disparaging remarks about someone's gender identity or gender expression, referring to someone by their birth gender instead of their identified gender, intimidating someone over their gender identity or gender expression, whistling or making catcalls at someone, offensive or sexual remarks made regarding a person's appearance, clothing, or body, inappropriate touching or body contact, including standing too close to or brushing up against someone.
Hey everyone, if you just watched this video and are thinking, how do I get more of these videos? Click on this link or go to gotsafety.com and we'll show you how you can digitally sign and record employee training records, build custom forms, or even access your OSHA documentation. Go to gotsafety.com right now or call 1-800-734-3574 for more information.